About 2 weeks ago, I was on my way to give my 161st presentation, I think, for the year. I live at 7,500 feet in Morrison, Colorado. I'm just above the Denver metro. And we were supposed to get 1.5 inches of snow, and of course it turned into 14 because mountains. And I'm realizing that there's no way anything is plowed. But it's like, no, that's right, I've got this. I got up early, gave myself an extra 1.5 hours to get in, just in case there was some sort of problem with the weather. And my snowblower was tuned up, because I had done it myself, and it was gassed and ready to go, so I did a quick plow, got on the road that hadn't been plowed yet, coming down the mountains from 7,500 feet to 5,000 feet in Denver. I get onto the highway, it's obvious who just moved from Texas. But that's okay, because I learned to drive in an Iowa winter, and for those of you guys who have been around for a little while, you remember back in 1988 when that Californian stole everybody's civic operating budget? Yeah, that happened in my hometown. And so I learned to drive in a year where the city council, in their eminent wisdom, decided that rather than cut services a little bit, they just kept taxes at the same level and had no services for 2 years. So we had no snow plowing in 1989 or 1990 when I was learning to drive. So I learned to drive on 6 inches of ice. And then in the summer of 1992, I worked at Philmont, and I helped do backcountry runs with the chaplains. And wow, you have not learned to drive until your instructor has God as a co-pilot. So all these skills are coming into play, and I'm getting out on the highway, and I'm going 70 when everybody else is going 35, and I'm literally drifting between buses, and I know how to do this. And I'm ahead of schedule, and I'm almost there, and of course that's when that idiot who decided that today was the day to move his boat got in front of me. But I get there on time, because I was prepared. I'd done my homework. I was trained. I gave myself a buffer. We're all gonna get there, folks. Iowa, more than most states, has done its homework. The baseline's fine. A lot of the issues I'm going to talk about today, it's not that they don't affect you, it's that you can handle them. Everyone else, they're moving their boat. Okay, that's not working either. Let's go over here. Okay, what we're looking at here is a map of the Russian space. We have to start with the war. On the left, you've got a combined, whoops, let's back up a little bit. On the left, you've got a combined climate and economic map, and on the right, you have a population density map. So let's start on the right. This is on its side, so if you have to tilt your head, I'm not gonna judge out loud. The lighter color of orange that's going from roughly Central Europe down into Central Siberia, that is where everybody lives. Now, if you will notice on the left, it overlays with the green. That is the Russian wheat belt. That's where you grow everything. Now, this is not a particularly great place to be, and there's not a lot of people here. So that lighter color of orange, that's roughly the population density of Nebraska if you remove Lincoln and Omaha. So, you do have neighbors, you do know their names, but whether they're alive or not, you really have no idea. The green zone, the wheat belt, is really, really crappy land. In fact, in terms of global agricultural basins, it's the least productive of them in the world, and it's because of the weather. In the summer, it's roughly the same as western Kansas, so hot and dry, and in the winter, it's about the same as northeastern Alberta, so cold, dry, windy. You can grow one wheat crop, and you have to kind of race to get it into the ground after the last frost and race to get it before the first frost, because those two dates are only about 3.5 months apart. And the income that you get from that one wheat crop is so low per acre that Russia has never been able to build a road network. If you want to move anything within the Russian space at scale, you have to do it by rail. Now, on the map on the left, if you go to the right, to the north, to the blue, you are in tundra and Tagai, completely empty. No one lives there. If you go to the left, to the yellow, to the south, you're in desert. No one lives there. But the real fun and games, the reason why the Russians drink so much, is the beige on the shoulders. Territories that even by the Russian definition are completely economically useless. But you could still shove a panzer division through that because it's flat. Russia has been invaded 50-odd times in its history. And every time a foreigner has made it to the green, the Russians have never driven them back. The weather has. Because the Russians can't move in their own space, but any foe who managed to get there clearly can cross distances at speed. So the only way the Russians have ever discovered that they can survive in their own neighborhood is to expand out of the green through the beige until they reach a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a Mongol horde through. And then they forward position their very, very slow-moving troops in the footprints between those barriers, plug the gaps. During the Soviet period, the Russians controlled every single one of those plugs. Post-Soviet Russia only controlled one. And everything that Vladimir Putin has done in foreign affairs since 1999 has been about repositioning that forward defensive perimeter. This is the Karabakh War, the Kazakh intervention, the Donbass War, the Crimea War, the Georgian War. He's about halfway done. The question has never been, will Russia stop before it has all of Ukraine? See, Russia and Ukraine doesn't control the gaps. Ukraine is on the way to the gaps. So the question has always been, how long will it take the Russians to reposition after they've conquered all of Ukraine and go to the next line of countries, which include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Poland? Who here is not from Texas? All right. I was good. Audience participation, this is promising. It's not as big as they think it is. The scale of what the Russians are trying to do here, we have a hard time wrapping our mind around it. I mean, the United States is a big country, but the Russians have 3 times the borders and half the population. If they can't forward position, they die. It's very, very simple. This war was always going to happen. Okay, so that's the big strategic picture. Let's look at the tactical picture. The dotted lines on this map are those all-important rail connections. The deep red were the territories that the Russians controlled at the end of the last war in 2014. So anyone who says if you just give the Russians a little bit of land, they'll stop, no. This is the 7th time they've done this since 1999, so duh. And then the pink areas are the territories that the Russians occupied as of the 1st of September. Now, you guys remember back to the beginning of the war in the very first week when we saw that giant 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles coming from Belarus south to Kiev? And most of us, myself included, thought, well, crap, that was fast. This is already over. And then on the 4th day of the war, that convoy stopped because they forgot fuel trucks. And on the 7th day of the war, the soldiers got out of the equipment and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. It's not COVID, I promise. Everyone I talked to at the Defense Department and every NATO defense ministry had the same general position. They're like, holy crap, the Russians do not know how to fight a war anymore. They have forgotten. They are doing worse than the Iraqis did in 1992 in Desert Storm. If NATO forces and Russian forces meet on the field of battle, they will be obliterated. It will be a 1,000-to-1 casualty ratio. We will destroy them as a conventional power in a matter of weeks. And this made no one happy. Because for the Russians, this is a battle for their existential survival. They can't stop, they won't stop. Which means nukes are on the table. And if we have a conventional fight, there will be a nuclear exchange. So the decision was made very, very early in the war that the Russian military had to be destroyed here, now, forever, but without a single NATO soldier, because then we would have the obliteration and the nukes would fly. So any weapon system that the Ukrainians can prove that they can competently operate, they can have. And to expand the list of things that they can competently operate, 60,000 Ukrainian troops are already training in NATO countries right now. 15,000 have already been deployed back to Ukraine. And with every month, the technological capacity for them to absorb weapons increases. That was our lesson. The Russians had their own. When it became apparent that the Ukrainians were fighting back, the Russian lesson was, well, crap, maybe we shouldn't have drank all of that Kool-Aid that we made. If the Ukrainians are not going to welcome us as liberators, then instead of being a non-issue, the civilians suddenly are a problem that we have to deal with. So we're going to dust off a strategy that we perfected well before World War I, that we've used in Chechnya and Syria. And we're going to advance very slowly under a hail of artillery, destroying not anything that moves, but instead anything that stands. Because if we can obliterate all civilian infrastructure, especially agricultural infrastructure, then this land becomes uninhabitable for a civilian population. And if we do that, the population will self-segregate. Most will run, they'll become refugees, and we never have to worry about them again. Anyone who stays, who is under age 55, clearly stayed to fight, and we can shoot them on sight. It's difficult to get good data on civilian casualties out of a war zone, but the best guess is over 250,000 civilians have been killed to this point, and at least 1 million have been kidnapped and shipped to Siberia, mostly children. The scale of the human devastation is on pace with the Holocaust. But that's the express goal, to eliminate the Ukrainians as a factor. Okay. About 3 months ago, almost 4 months ago now, sorry, the Ukrainians started advertising that they were going to launch an assault here on what is known as the Kherson Pocket. It's the only chunk of territory west of the river that the Ukrainians lost to the Russians early in the war. The Russians saw the advertisements and started moving troops to that pocket, about 20,000 troops in total in addition to what was already there, their best troops, their best equipment. Now, as we all know, that wasn't the only thing going on. The Ukrainians were watching to see where those troops were pulled from, and they launched a second offensive here in Kharkiv. And the Kharkiv front completely collapsed in 5 days. The best part of that is you'll notice, you see the city of Lyman, just below that there's a little dingleberry of territory. That's the city of Izium. Izium was their forward deployment base, their forward logistical hub, where they had all of their tanks and all of their ammo and all of their artillery, and it fell in 36 hours intact. In 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more gear from the Russians than NATO had transferred to them in 7 months. They captured more in 36 hours than they had started the war with. And territory changed. We're now in a bit of a holding pattern. It's been mud season until very recently. Can you imagine basically operating a tank in a farm field when it's saturated with fall weather? You don't move. So now that things are freezing solid, we're probably going to see a little bit of movement. And now it's kind of a war of logistics. What we've got here in the south, that's the Kerch Strait Bridge. You'll notice the dotted line. Kerch is the only rail connection between Russia proper and the southern front. And a few weeks ago, somebody blows it up, which means that anything that the Russians want to bring into the front now has to be moved by truck. Now, you guys remember those javelins from earlier in the war? For the most part, the Ukrainians were not targeting tanks or artillery. They were targeting military tactical support trucks, of which the Russians started the war with about 3,000. They're now down to under 800. So they've literally been going town by town in the Russian Federation